They say there's beauty in simplicity. If that's true, then VVVVVV, developed by Terry Kavanagh and released on January 11th, 2010, might just be the most beautiful game ever made. Everything in VVVVVV is simple. The story, the music, the mechanics, the gameplay. VVVVVV is so simple, it focuses on only one mechanic. The game's description on Steam puts this best. VVVVVV is a platform game all about exploring one simple mechanical idea. What if you reversed gravity instead of jumping? If you're thinking an entire game built on one idea sounds pretty minimalist, you're right. Minimalism drives VVVVVV. There is no health, no lives, no power-ups. It has only two hazards, stationary spikes and moving enemies, which otherwise function identically. There are no advanced movement options, no upgrades. VVVVVV is so minimalist, the game has only two verbs, move and flip. With the left and right arrow keys, the player can move Viridian left and right on the screen, while Viridian is standing on ground, pressing the up arrow, or the down arrow, or the Z key, or the spacebar, or, critically, the V key, will cause Viridian to flip, reversing the direction of gravity. VVVVVV is even more minimalist than it first appears. Unlike other platformers, Viridian accelerates the same in the air as he does on the ground. Given how much time is spent falling, this tight handling makes a lot of sense. There are only two verbs, but there are also only two states, air and ground, and only one verb is affected by them. Where some might object to this staunch minimalism, I think it gives VVVVVV great clarity. The game is about moving and flipping, and it is only about moving and flipping, nothing else. It has only and exactly the mechanics absolutely necessary for it to function. You might think, this is where I'd talk about the mechanic of gravity flipping, but I'm not going to do that. There is no point in analyzing gravity flipping as a mechanic, because VVVVVV already performs this analysis itself. Wordlessly, it offers a perfect description of this mechanic through the language of its design. In short, reviewing VVVVVV does not mean reviewing gravity flipping, because VVVVVV is itself a review of gravity flipping. Reviewing VVVVVV means reviewing gravity flipping. Now that the semantic satiation has set in, we can begin a review of VVVVVV. Let's start by addressing the game's whimsical title. I've already spoken the title aloud 13 times so far in this review. This brings the total V count so far to 78. 79 if you include the one I've just said. 80 if you include my reference to the V key on the keyboard, and 81 if you again include the one I've just said. In the interest of brevity, I and many others opt for alternative pronunciations of the game's title. There is evidence to suggest that Terry Kavanagh pronounces the game's title V. I've heard other pronunciations as well, like V6 or V, or even the letter V 6 times. Part of the charm of the title is that there's no real correct answer here. I will be opting for my own personal pronunciation, VVV. I like it because it captures the whimsy of the full title while still being succinct. This out of the way, we can begin the review proper. In the spirit of minimalism, VVV has scant few mechanics other than gravity flipping. What it lacks in breadth of mechanics, it makes up for in depth. At the heart of this mechanical depth is the proverbial spike. Spikes are VVV's most important tool for introducing difficulty and punishing player mistakes. VVV is absolutely littered with spikes. There are so many spikes in VVV that the game is named after them. Touch a spike and Viridian dies, respawning at whichever checkpoint he touched last. Spikes and checkpoints are the yin-yang of VVV. We avoid spikes. We seek checkpoints. This all sounds simple, but checkpoints are a Swiss Army knife for level design. Sure, checkpoints can be placed into stages as checkpoints, but they function as so much more. Sometimes they function as signposts. Many of VVV's rooms are difficult to wrap your head around. We are used to understanding the game world through jumping, not through gravity flipping. This effect is so strong that at the time of writing, Wikipedia calls VVV a puzzle platformer, despite the fact that the game contains no puzzles. This in mind, checkpoints serve to signpost some of the game's more confusing rooms. Here, the player is likely to enter the room from the bottom, but the upcoming challenge must be started from the top. This checkpoint draws us upwards. Here, it is much easier to begin the room from above rather than below, and 2 checkpoints tell us this. Sometimes, checkpoints serve a navigational role. Checkpoints are placed visibly at the start of most major stages. Checkpoints are inviting. They draw us in to the game's stages. Sometimes, checkpoints even function as an obstacle. Checkpoints are not a choice. Viridian always respawns at the last checkpoint, whether or not you want him to. This is usually utilized in the optional challenges to collect shiny trinkets. Often, these trinkets are placed behind unavoidable checkpoints. After collecting the trinket, the checkpoint forces the player to go backwards through the same challenge, making the trinkets even harder to collect. There's one particularly memorable trinket that takes this concept to its logical extreme. Collecting this trinket requires the player to intentionally die, warping between the 2 disjoint halves of the room. To accomplish this, the player must first hit the checkpoint near the trinket, and then must navigate to the other side of the room without hitting any checkpoints in between. The 3 rooms the player must travel through make this as hard as possible. Checkpoints are placed directly in the player's path, functioning here as a hazard, not a help. The point is, checkpoints speak to the utility VVV gets out of its mechanics. Think about all the mechanics Super Mario Bros. Needs to function. Checkpoints function simultaneously as flagpoles, mushrooms, coins, one-way doors, signposts, and occasionally hazards. With this single mechanic, VVV has an entire game's worth of Mario Maker objects to play around with. Checkpoints and spikes are the meat and potatoes of VVV's design, but there are a few other supporting mechanics. Like any platformer made in a post-Donkey Kong Country world, VVV is obliged to differentiate its levels with one-off stage gimmicks. The laboratory has flip lines that reverse gravity when you pass through them. Space Station 2 features conveyor belts. The Warp Zone has screen wrapping, and the Tower is the obligatory auto-scroller. These 4 mechanics are not at all random. Each further elaborates the central mechanic of gravity flipping. The flip lines in the laboratory are a natural extension of flipping. In the same way, the conveyor belts are a natural extension of VVV's other verb, moving. The other 2 mechanics are more generic, but still well suited to the game. VVV, compared to other platformers, gets a ton of use out of vertical screen wrapping because of the gravity flipping. Many screens in the Warp Zone require quick flips back and forth along the vertical wrap. The screen wrapping, in tandem with flipping gravity, allows for some seriously labyrinthine room layouts. These twisting screens in the Warp Zone are probably what inspired Wikipedia to call VVV a puzzle platformer, despite the fact that the game contains no puzzles. Similarly, VVV features auto-scrolling in both the tower and the final level, but these auto-scrollers are always vertical. Because of the gravity flipping, VVV gets far more utility out of vertically oriented challenges than other platformers. The tower is an incredibly dynamic stage to play. Sometimes the player is expected to quickly maneuver through the challenges to avoid being left behind. Other times, the tower throws long, precise falls at the player, forcing them to instead slow down and carefully time their movements. Even the intermission stages play into the central mechanic. Between the second and third and fourth stages of VVV are 2 short intermissions. The second intermission presents us with the Gravitron, a minigame where the player must dodge projectiles for 1 minute, with checkpoints every 5 seconds. The first intermission explores a subtle mechanic already seen elsewhere in the game. After rescuing one of the crew members, they'll follow the player until they reach a teleporter. These teleporters are always immediately accessible, with no hazards in the way. But in the first intermission, Viridian must guide the crew member through an actual stage. The other crew member follows Viridian when Viridian is standing on the ground, and stops completely when Viridian is standing on the ceiling. This mechanic is compelling because it forces the player to consider multiple effects of a single action. Flipping is necessary to enable Viridian's platforming, but it also controls how the crew member will move. On this screen, for instance, Viridian must flip to navigate this winding path, but doing so puts the crew member at risk of hitting one of the nearby hazards. On this screen, there's a relatively simple path forward, but Viridian must platform to a small alcove so that the crew member can be controlled effectively. This means that VVV has accomplished the unheard double whammy of 2D platformers. In its short runtime, it manages to deliver a good auto-scroller and a good escort mission. All these mechanics would go to waste without excellent level design. This in mind, the level design of VVV is the most important aspect of the game. But equally, it is completely subservient. It exists only to make the other aspects of the work shine brighter. As important as it is dull, good level design is a lot like doing your homework. With that in mind, let's do ours and break down the level design in my favorite stage, the laboratory. The stage opens with the player flipping down directly onto a flip line. There is no time for a player to worry about whether this new mechanic is helpful or dangerous. They cannot avoid falling down and hitting the flip line. After they collide, the player bounces back in the direction they came automatically, and thus in one screen has already learned how this mechanic works. The next few screens continue to use these flip lines sort of like trampolines. However, after falling down deeper into the stage, the player encounters a vertical flip line for the first time. There is a puzzling corridor that forces the player to come to terms with how these flip lines operate, before immediately throwing the player into a handful of challenges that make use of vertical flip lines. Having now laid the groundwork, the rest of the laboratory is a gauntlet of different twists on this one mechanic. Next, the player finds themselves between two flip lines, where the player must dodge hazards while only being able to control Viridian on the horizontal axis. Next, the player must carefully time movements while being bounced back and forth across a screen transition. The final segment is a really interesting use of the vertical flip lines, where the player must zigzag up and down across the rooms avoiding hazards. The laboratory is probably VVV's best stage, but the quality of level design is consistently high throughout the entire game. Level design is the cornerstone of VVV, but the game does actually have a narrative. Encountering a teleporter malfunction, 6 members of a space crew are stranded across an alien dimension. The vessel's first in command, Captain Viridian, sets out into the uncharted dimension to rescue his lost crew. This plot is simple, but it actually accomplishes quite a lot. Captain Viridian's search for his lost crew forms the basis of the story's conflict, but it also serves a mechanical function as the game's primary objective. Games that don't make narrative their focus often stumble into some degree of ludonarrative dissonance, however small. In Super Mario 64, Mario's objective is to rescue Peach, but mechanically, the player's objective is exploring stages to collect Power Stars. Narratively, Peach is extremely important, and yet she is all but forgotten when it comes to the core gameplay. VVV aligns its narrative and mechanical objectives with this premise. VVV replaces the Power Stars with several smaller Peaches for Captain Viridian to rescue at the end of each stage. The other subtle advantage of VVV's plot is how it grounds the game's mechanics. Traditional 2D platformers have an advantage in this regard. We have to suspend our disbelief enough to stomach Mario's massive jumps, but jumping in and of itself is a relatively grounded mechanic that needs little explanation. The ability to reverse gravity, on the other hand, is supernatural, and thus demands at least some narrative explanation. In a blog post from July 15th, 2009, providing early details of VVV, Kavanaugh actually explains the gravity flipping in a different way. The entire game is designed around one really simple mechanic, which you might have seen in the Bytejacker preview: zero gravity jumping. Whenever you jump, you take off into the air and don't stop until you hit a ceiling. Then you can walk around for a bit and jump back down. Because VVV is set in outer space, the gravity flipping mechanic feels completely natural. Players can easily imagine that rather than reversing gravity, Captain Viridian is really just jumping off of the ground and being carried along until the next time he collides with a surface. This isn't completely accurate, of course. When walking off of a ledge, Captain Viridian falls down rather than continuing along at the same altitude as would actually be the case in a zero-gravity environment. But in terms of suspension of disbelief, this is a comparatively small hurdle for the player to overcome. I think my favorite narrative touch in VVV is how the teleporter malfunctions are handled. You may not have noticed this, but whenever a character is transported somewhere, their sudden arrival destroys the terrain around them in the pattern of concentric squares. We can see these concentric squares in the first room of the game, where Viridian is teleported, but actually, all 4 other characters leave similarly shaped craters at their respective crash sites. We can use this to tell where the characters actually ended up after VVV's opening cutscene. Victoria and Verdigris, for instance, don't get far, as they are both found relatively close to the teleportation crater. Vitellari's crash site is just after the halfway point of Space Station 2, indicating that he actually cleared half the level himself. Vermilion, ever adventurous, was teleported at the start of the tower, and cleared the entire level himself to reach the end. Once you realize this, the first room of the tower makes much more sense. The room Teleporter Divot has a seemingly pointless one-way drop, completely undermined by a checkpoint at the top. This one-way drop does not serve a mechanical function. It serves a narrative function. The one-way path explains why Vermilion, who teleported into the bottom of the room, was unable to leave through the entrance, and was forced to travel through the tower to escape. Maybe the only attribute of VVV that doesn't directly relate to the central mechanic is the art style. Like other indie precision platformers from the 2010s, VVV has a pixel art aesthetic, but unlike other indie precision pixel art platformers, VVV opts for extremely low fidelity. Indie games often imitate SNES level graphics. At their worst, they come close to NES games. VVV looks exactly like something off of the Commodore 64. VVV looks so much like a Commodore 64 game that someone actually ported it to the Commodore 64. Like everything in VVV, the Commodore 64 aesthetic is more than skin deep. Rather than just mimicking the aesthetics, VVV manages to capture the very soul of a Commodore 64 game. The 1985 Commodore 64 game Monty on the Run was hugely influential to VVV's design. Many aesthetic aspects of Monty on the Run are carried over to VVV. The weird and abstract enemies, the monochromatic sprite work. The clearest source of inspiration are the room names that literally underscore each screen of VVV's main stages. These titles serve the same purpose in both VVV and Monty on the Run. With the visuals as surreal and abstract as they are, it is these titles that ground the action on screen. Most of Monty on the Run's titles are short, literal descriptions, but VVV's titles are much more varied. Sometimes they are just as literal as the titles in Monty on the Run. Other times they are quite clever, delivering a punchline, or a reference, or an interesting recontextualization of the scene. I don't need to tell you that these rooms are well named. They were titled by none other than Bennett Foddy. Bennett Foddy's titles are so universally excellent that when he developed the 2017 game Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, he put his own name in the title. More than just these window dressings, VVV also captures the flow of a Commodore 64 game. Commodore 64 games were often half platformer, half adventure. They featured platforming challenges, but set in a fully explorable 2D environment. Inspired by this, VVV is technically an open-world game. The 4 main stages of VVV need to be discovered through exploration, and can be completed by the player in any order. Like any good open-world game, care was taken in how these stages are arranged in the overworld. After exiting the ship, the player is likely to fall straight down 3 screens where they will land in this room. The player is free to travel left or right, but there's also a small cave that, after a few more rooms, eventually leads to one of VVV's main stages, the laboratory. Enhancing this effect is the fact that the cave is marked by a checkpoint. There is no danger in this room, of course, but players are still going to be drawn to hitting checkpoints. This is a pretty powerful effect. Personally, the laboratory was the first stage I completed in VVV, and based off of watching several YouTube Let's Plays, I would wager more than half of all players end up completing the laboratory first. This is a wise compromise. VVV offers the player absolute freedom, but by placing one of the easier stages so close to the start, it still retains some semblance of a difficulty curve. Really, the allusions to the Commodore 64 are like every aspect of VVV we've looked at so far. Minimalism defines VVV. Everything from the graphics to the gameplay, from the narrative to the mechanics, was designed with minimalism in mind. But that does not, by any means, imply VVV is trite. Pick any one of these elements and you'll find absolutely impeccable design so good it rivals any of VVV's much more complex peers. VVV is a simple game, but it harnesses that simplicity as a strength to deliver an incredibly focused, elegant experience. Except, I don't actually think that VVV is a simple game. If you think that VVV is a simple game, I don't blame you. Let's be honest, the game not only looks like a Flash game from 2010, it is a Flash game from 2010. What more could there be to a game this small, this compact, this, well, simple? If you haven't played VVV, I understand why you'd think this. Hell, I'm sure there are many people who have played VVV that still think of it as a simple game. It's understandable, but it couldn't be further from the truth. VVV is not at all a simple game. I say this with confidence because I, too, underestimated VVV. On June 8th, 2024, I released my first video on YouTube, a review of Super Mario 64. This was my first completed review, but it was not the first I started. I began writing the script for Super Mario 64 on May 5th, 2024, meaning I finished the project in just under 5 weeks. The video you are watching right now, I first started working on more than 2 years ago. I've been interested in games criticism for a really long time, but in March of 2022, I finally decided to take the plunge and try my hand at making my own reviews. There were, and are, many games I'd love to make reviews for, but I knew there would be many lessons I learned from making these, and so, for my first review, I wanted to pick something small, something achievable, something that wouldn't overwhelm me. In short, I tried to pick something simple. I picked VVV. On March 23rd, 2022, I sat down at my computer and I began writing the first iteration of this review. On April 26th, 2022, I scrapped what I had written and started fresh. On May 26th, 2022, I started over a third time. On September 17th, 2022, I started over a fourth time. Actually, this very segment you are listening to right now has its origins in that fourth draft. On September 17th, 2022, after 3 failed drafts, finally reckoning with the position I had placed myself in, I wrote, "I've been interested in reviewing video games for a while now, and have quite a long backlog of games I'd like to write about. In retrospect, I understand why I picked this game to write about first. I realize that I thought the way you probably do. VVV will be an easy first video to write, because VVV is a very simple game." I could not have been more wrong. I am, right now, currently writing the 4th iteration of this script. I have scrapped about 5,000 words so far. I, on some level, still doubt the words I am writing now will see the light of day. In short, I have not found VVV to be simple. I wrote this on September 17th, 2022, but at the time, I didn't know how true those words were. On October 25th, 2022, 7 months after I began writing the script, I finally gave up. If VVV really were as simple as it seems, then this video would be 30 minutes shorter and would have been finished 2 years ago. Writing a review of VVV like the one you've witnessed so far is a relatively easy task, and it's something I mostly accomplished back in 2022. But as you consider VVV more deeply, it becomes apparent just how incomplete that understanding is. VVV may appear simple, but for designer Terry Kavanagh, VVV was a relatively large project. A prolific game jammer, Kavanagh's body of work is characterized by frequent, incredibly small games, much more like sketches of ideas than finished concepts. VVV is, by all respects, a small game, but at the time of its release in 2010, it was undoubtedly Kavanagh's largest. Considering its sheer volume, Kavanagh's work covers a wide variety of genres. Before the release of VVV, Kavanagh had made puzzle games, management sims, bullet hells, and even a handful of experimental, narrative-focused titles. Kavanagh had made few 2D platformers before VVV, none of which I'd really consider precision platformers. The formation of a genre is not always clear-cut, but I'd point to the 2004 title Jumper as the first precision platformer. Very difficult platformers existed before Jumper, but Jumper's difficulty is something different. Jumper is difficult, but in an incredibly fair way. It establishes its difficulty not through cheap tricks, or through long, punishing stages. Instead, Jumper's difficulty stems from the sheer density of its hazards. The defining characteristic of the level design in Jumper is how much it constrains the player. Ogmo, the game's player character, can move, jump, and double jump, but these abilities are hardly freeing. The stages in Jumper often require moving, jumping, and double jumping in exactly the right way, at exactly the right time. Traditional platformers often entertain by giving the player options. Jumper is the complete opposite. It is compelling because of what players cannot do. Jumper is a pretty rough game. The designer was 16 at the time of its release. But Jumper's dense level design taps into something that other games at the time didn't. I must not have been the only person who thought so, because 6 years later, and with a suspiciously similar red cubic mascot, Super Meat Boy would popularize the precision platformer genre. Ogmo, the protagonist of Jumper, actually makes a cameo appearance as an unlockable character in Super Meat Boy. So too does Captain Viridian. After releasing Jumper in 2004, the game's designer, Matty Thorson, would go on to spend the next 14 years perfecting the precision platformer. Matty would create 2 sequels to Jumper, along with several other platformers like the 2010 Flash game Give Up Robot, and the 2013 commercial release Towerfall. Finally, on January 25, 2018, after 3 years of development, Matty Thorson and her team would release Celeste. Celeste is an incredible game, but that is not why I bring it up in this review. The point I want to make is that Celeste is no accident. Celeste is the culmination of over a decade of design and iteration. Celeste, of course, has its roots in a 2015 Game Jam prototype of the same name, but we can trace its design much further into the past. The green gems that reset Madeline's dash are directly lifted from Jumper 14 years prior. Terry Kavanagh, on the other hand, did not spend 14 years making precision platformers. VVV was, really, Kavanagh's only contribution to this subgenre. Initially, it makes a lot of sense to understand VVV as a precision platformer. Its design certainly shares many similarities with the likes of Celeste, but when we try to place VVV in the context of other precision platformers, this facade shatters. VVV wasn't the direct inspiration of other precision platformers, nor would it ultimately inspire others. As you look deeper at VVV, it stops looking like a precision platformer at all. If we want to understand VVV, we have to break this preconception. Sine Wave Ninja was developed in 2 hours by Terry Kavanagh on May 19, 2009 for the 23rd Click of the Month Club, a now defunct, then monthly event dedicated to the click and play game engine. In Sine Wave Ninja, the unnamed player character, a ninja, perpetually travels in sinusoid motion along the vertical axis. The player does not control the ninja's vertical motion, but can use the left and right arrow keys to control the ninja's horizontal position. If the player presses Z, the ninja will fire projectiles in 8 directions. Enemies fly at the ninja. They must be dodged or destroyed with the projectiles. The goal of Sine Wave Ninja is to score as many points as possible by defeating these enemies. Unsurprisingly, seeing as the game was made in 2 hours, Sine Wave Ninja is full of faults. Art and music are essentially non-existent. Enemies spawn without any warning, which gives the player no time to react when near the edges of the screen. Worst of all is the fact that the ninja clearly begins above the vertical axis. This implies that the ninja in Sine Wave Ninja is actually a cosine wave ninja. Despite these flaws, something about Sine Wave Ninja spoke to Kavanaugh. I can see why. The game is so simple, but the rhythmic vertical motion is weirdly mesmerizing. At the end of Kavanaugh's blog post releasing Sine Wave Ninja, he mentions, "Actually, I'm pretty tempted to take a few days out to turn this little prototype into a real game. I think it's got potential to be pretty addictive." Kavanaugh would go on to turn Sine Wave Ninja into a full game. Though he initially planned to spend a few days on the concept, those few days quickly turned to weeks, and then to months. 9 months later, on January 11th, 2010, Kavanaugh released his follow-up to Sine Wave Ninja, VVV. Like many games, VVV originated from a Game Jam prototype. But what's surprising is that VVV ostensibly bears no resemblance to Sine Wave Ninja. Just look at Celeste's prototype, Celeste 2015. Obviously, the full game is more polished, but all the basic mechanics are present in the original. The full game, Celeste 2018, and the prototype, Celeste 2015, are so similar they share a title. VVV and Sine Wave Ninja aren't even the same genre. Really, there's only one commonality. Both are games about reversing gravity. This is how serious VVV is about its central mechanic. VVV is so dedicated that it let the mechanic inform the genre. VVV started out not as a 2D platformer, but as a game about reversing gravity. VVV is a 2D platformer because that turned out to be the most effective way to explore this mechanic. After all, every platformer is, in some sense, a game about gravity. If instead, the best way to explore reversing gravity was with a match 3 puzzle game, then VVV may have been a Bejeweled clone instead. Mario jumps because Super Mario Bros. Is a platformer. Doom Guy shoots because Doom is a first-person shooter. But VVV is a platformer because Viridian flips. So I think it's incorrect to say that VVV bears no resemblance to Sine Wave Ninja. Only one mechanic is shared, but that one mechanic is the keystone of both games. As it turns out, like Celeste, VVV and Sine Wave Ninja are so similar that they share a title. The repeated V's strung together appear decidedly sinusoid. VVV pays tribute to Sine Wave Ninja by literally titling itself with a sine wave. Well, technically, with a cosine wave. In a secret room in the 3rd chapter of Celeste, Madeline can find an arcade machine. Interacting with it allows the player to play the very prototype that would eventually become Celeste. That's how I've been recording footage of Celeste's prototype for this very review. Just as Celeste 2015 is playable within Celeste 2018, so too is Sine Wave Ninja playable in VVV. You've seen it already earlier in this review. It's called the Gravitron. Initially, the Gravitron seems like a weird one-off moment. Shifting the mode of play completely creates a nice break between the focused platforming of VVV's other stages, and it's a brilliant recontextualization of the flip lines from the laboratory. The Graviton is no doubt a memorable sequence, but once we understand that the Gravitron is really just Sine Wave Ninja 2, it changes shape completely. Sine Wave Ninja, as VVV's prototype, represents the distilled essence of what makes VVV itself. If that's so, then the Gravitron, as Sine Wave Ninja 2, is the crystallized soul of VVV. Everything in VVV is about reversing gravity, but the Gravitron is the single part of VVV most about reversing gravity. And yet, the Gravitron is also the part of VVV least similar to a precision platformer. VVV, minimalist as it may be, still contains many supporting mechanics and ideas meant to enhance and iterate upon its central mechanic. But for this short sequence, that noise drops away. For this fleeting moment, the Gravitron allows us to stare at the game's soul. And what we see is not a precision platformer. What we see is Sine Wave Ninja. On March 5th, 2009, 2 months before Sine Wave Ninja, Kavanaugh released Don't Look Back. Though I'd consider VVV his breakout title, Don't Look Back was Kavanaugh's first true success. According to Kavanaugh's blog, 4 days after release, Don't Look Back was played almost 300,000 times. At that point, 10 times the rest of his games combined. Don't Look Back is even shorter than VVV, and free to play. If you're interested, I suggest you pause the video at this point and play the game yourself. If you don't want to, that's fine. Either way, I want to start by summarizing an average player's experience with the game. Don't Look Back is a narrative-focused, monochromatic, run-and-gun 2D platformer. The first screen of the game, doubling as the title screen, depicts the player character solemnly standing over a grave. When we gain control, the only thing we can do is proceed to the right. After jumping down a cliff, we pick up a handgun. At this point, our character's goals are not made clear to us. However, since all we can do is proceed right, we guide our character regardless. As we move to the right, we continue to descend downwards, first through a dark cave, and next across an underground sea of lava. The low-fidelity graphics give a deliberately vague view of the surrounding terrain, but the lava and demonic enemies are a pretty big hint as to where we are. Finally, we encounter a boss fight against a massive demon. Defeating the demon and proceeding right one more screen, we find the ghost of a girl. Recalling the game's title screen, we finally come to realize the true nature of our character's quest: to rescue his lost love from the pits of hell. This demon is the final boss of Don't Look Back, but it is not the end. Once we reach the ghost, she begins to follow us. Now, we must turn around and begin our ascent back up out of the underworld. It will differ from player to player, but at some point during this ascent, the player will try to move backwards. In doing so, they'll stumble into Don't Look Back's twist. When the player turns to face the ghost, she disappears with a haunting wail, and the screen must be restarted. The rest of the game must be completed without ever looking back. Don't Look Back does a great job of withholding narrative context from the player. Initially, it seems like the title, Don't Look Back, refers to our character attempting to move on from his recent tragedy. Only now, in the last few moments of the game, we realize the true meaning of Don't Look Back, that the entire game is a retelling of the Greek myth of Orpheus. For those unfamiliar, Orpheus, saddened by his wife Eurydice's passing, travels to the underworld hoping to bring her back to life. Hades, the god of the underworld, allows Eurydice to return on the condition that she must follow behind Orpheus, and that Orpheus cannot look back to see if she follows. In the end, Orpheus cannot resist the urge to look back, trapping Eurydice in the underworld forever. That, however, is not how Don't Look Back ends. Our player character proceeds onwards, up out of the underworld, all the way back to the grave from the beginning of the game. Reaching the first screen, the man ultimately finds himself, standing over the grave, just like in the start. Suddenly, with the same haunting scream, the ghost and the player character both disappear, leaving the man standing alone at the grave once again. Games often attempt to impress upon us a sense of freedom. Don't Look Back is the complete opposite. In a medium of infinite possibilities, Don't Look Back is a game defined by what you cannot do. The first half of Don't Look Back serves to establish a baseline, one that will inevitably be ripped out from under the player. After playing an entire traditional run-and-gun platformer, including a final boss, the inability to move right hits like a ton of bricks. In my first playthrough, I never got used to it. I was still 2 screens from the end of the game, absent-mindedly pressing right to adjust my jumps. This is how I understand Don't Look Back. It presents itself as a game about running and jumping. But really, Don't Look Back is a game about not moving to the right. Take a moment to realize how unique this is. How many games can you think of that are defined by the absence of something? I lack a word for this, so I'll borrow a term from the visual arts. Don't Look Back is a game about negative space. Negative space is best known from the Rubens vase optical illusion. Here, the subject of the illustration is a vase, but the vase carves out the shape of two faces in the surrounding blank space. Games are visual, so they can make visual use of negative space, but here I use this word mechanically. If the subject of a game is the set of mechanics and systems present within, then the equivalent of negative space would be all of the possible mechanics the designers chose to leave out. Broadly speaking, many games are about using a limited set of tools to accomplish some objective. But Don't Look Back is unique in how much emphasis it puts on these limitations. Mario can't swing a sword, he can't fly, and he definitely can't reverse gravity. But when you're playing Super Mario Bros., you're probably not thinking about flying, sword fighting, or gravity flipping. But when you play Don't Look Back, you definitely will think about moving right. In the Greek myth, Orpheus only loses Eurydice due to his own folly. Don't Look Back tells a different story. In the world of Don't Look Back, death is final. There is nothing the man can do to bring back his lost love. Don't Look Back is not a story of deception, of regret, of mistakes. It's a story of inability. We never really control the man. As the ending reveals to us, the entire game exists in the man's fantasy. The only glimpse we have of reality, the game's title, is also the only moment we are not in control of the man. Don't Look Back draws us the boundary between reality and fantasy, what we can control and what we cannot. As players, the fate of thousands rests in our hands, of Captain Viridian, of Madeline, of the man. We can control their lives, but Don't Look Back reminds us that we cannot control our own. Using negative mechanical space like this is relatively uncommon in games. There are a handful of other examples of this philosophy of design, but they are still few and far between. Not so for Terry Kavanagh. Pathways actually uses the same concept as Don't Look Back. In the game, you can only move right. In Pathways' case, it is a metaphor for life, that the choices we make can never be undone. Judith, the collaboration between Terry Kavanagh and Stephen Lavelle, is also a game defined by what the player cannot do. I intend to talk about Judith someday in the future, so I will show uncharacteristic restraint and leave it at that. Actually, if you think about it, even Sine Wave Ninja falls into this category. What makes Sine Wave Ninja interesting is the juxtaposition between unconstrained horizontal movement and completely constrained vertical movement. Sine Wave Ninja is as much a game about moving left and right as it is about not moving up and down. All four of these games were released in 2009, 1 year before VVV. So it is no stretch to say that this particular vein of minimalism characterizes much of Kavanagh's work. There is one more game defined by its use of negative space I'd like to touch on. That game is, of course, VVV. Having now understood its predecessors, VVV's striking differences from other precision platformers start to make more sense. Take, for instance, the open world. It is atypical for a precision platformer to have an extensive overworld. Super Meat Boy and Celeste opt for glorified level select menus. Dust Force features a hub world along the lines of Peach's Castle, but the stages themselves are completely isolated. The End is Nigh does feature a seamless world, but there isn't anything by way of non-linearity. Each stage funnels directly into the next, almost like one really long Celeste chapter. The closest any platformers come to VVV's overworld are Metroidvanias. Metroidvanias do make exploration an emphasis, but the style of exploration is completely different. Metroidvanias are far more linear than VVV. They typically bottleneck or otherwise restrict player progression through their worlds. This is the antithesis to VVV's exploration. Even though it is a 2D platformer, VVV is more fundamentally Zelda than it is Metroid. It's not surprising that the likes of Super Meat Boy, Celeste, and Dust Force do not feature open worlds. These are precision platformers. Gameplay should be the focus. A non-linear open world would only serve to dilute the core gameplay. However, as Sine Wave Ninja revealed to us, VVV is not trying to be a precision platformer. VVV is trying to be a game about reversing gravity. Tight platforming challenges is one aspect of this mechanic, but the other is the freedom it gives the player. Cliffs not even Madeline could scale are trivial for Captain Viridian, and the wide open spaces of VVV's overworld give room for the sense of freedom to shine. Like the Gravitron, the overworld shows us a different side to gravity flipping. The high difficulty of VVV's stages are beautifully underscored by the calm universe they reside within. It's amazing that a game as small as VVV is able to so effortlessly capture the vastness of our universe. The setting is no mistake. VVV is as much a precision platformer as it is a space opera. When I think back to my first playthrough of VVV, it is not the platforming I remember, it's the exploration. What stuck with me most was the feeling of using Viridian's powers to chart this vast, unknown dimension. I first played VVV in middle school. The exploration imprints on your mind so powerfully that 12 years later, I still remember the exact order I first completed the stages in. To me, exploration is as vital to the game as platforming. VVV is as much defined by its dense spike-ridden corridors as it is by the vast, empty world they populate. The levels are equally important as the space around them. In other words, VVV is a game about negative space. This is one way in which VVV is about negative space, but this isn't exactly the same way we were using the term earlier. In Don't Look Back, the negative space present was not topographic in nature. Rather, it stemmed directly from the game's mechanics. Literal negative space is important to VVV, but so too is mechanical negative space, similar to Don't Look Back. Let us return to the description we saw at the very start of this review. VVV is a platform game all about exploring one simple mechanical idea. What if you reversed gravity instead of jumping? It's been hiding in plain sight from the very beginning. The central mechanical idea is not, what if you reversed gravity? It's, what if you reversed gravity instead of jumping? If this is true, then VVV is as much a game about reversing gravity as it is a game about not jumping. A point I've kept coming back to is the ways in which VVV differs from traditional platformers. This is easily the biggest difference. If you asked anyone what the defining characteristic of a platformer is, odds are most would say platformers are games about jumping. And yet, we've been calling VVV a platformer for the better part of an hour, despite the fact that Captain Viridian cannot jump. There are scant few games that claim to be 2D platformers without jumping. Many claim, for instance, that Burger Time was the first platformer without jumping. This is not an opinion I share. In Burger Time, you climb up and down ladders to stack burgers and avoid enemies. Apart from the fact that the burgers in Burger Time fall down, gravity does not play any role. From a mechanical perspective, Burger Time is more Pac-Man than it is Donkey Kong. VVV, on the other hand, still captures the spirit of a platformer even without jumping. Undoubtedly, video games have come a long way since Burger Time. I think the reason VVV stands out among other games with similar ambitions is simply that flipping gravity is a great replacement for jumping. Gravity flipping captures all the nuance of timing and positioning that makes jumping compelling. It just so happens that the ground is above you rather than below. Gravity flipping also makes perfect sense in the realm of a platformer. I have a silly little heuristic I often use to judge platformers. It goes like this. Any old hack can make a fun platformer level moving upwards, but it takes a master to design a stage moving downwards. Or, in other words, anyone could have made Chapter 1 of Celeste, but only Maddie Thorson could make Chapter 6. I don't take this maxim very seriously, but it's surprising how accurate I find it to be. Edmund McMillan, the designer of the 2010 game Super Meat Boy, released a spiritual sequel, The End Is Nigh, in 2017. Both games are great, but stages that move downward reveal McMillan's 7 years of growth. Super Meat Boy has few stages that really focus on falling, and the ones that do are some of the game's worst. But the Hollows in The End Is Nigh is one of the best and most dynamic stages to play. By the way, if you're wondering, Super Mario 64 passes this test. Cool Cool Mountain is entirely about descending. If this is how we judge the quality of a platformer, then VVV is the best platformer ever made. What happens when you reverse gravity? You fall. Captain Viridian, at no point in the game, ever actually moves upwards. He just alters which way down is. As a result, VVV is an entire game about falling. Knowing how difficult it is to design stages like this makes VVV's achievements all the more impressive. Looking at gravity flipping from this perspective paints a wholly different picture. Thus far, gravity flipping seemed to be something akin to a superpower. It certainly feels that way when you're witnessing Viridian fly effortlessly through screen after screen of empty space. And at times, it definitely is. Throw Mario into VVV and he wouldn't be able to get past the first 3 screens. However, flipping gravity is as powerful as it is constraining. Place any sort of horizontal gap in the way and Viridian's limitations are immediately felt. Just as Mario would struggle in the world of VVV, a pit you might find in the first stage of a Mario game proves an insurmountable challenge for Captain Viridian. Any horizontal gap, no matter how small, must be carefully considered by the player. Flipping is far more committal than jumping. There must be safe ceiling above the player. If not, then even the smallest gap is an impassable gorge. Now, the conveyor belts in Space Station 2 finally start to make more sense. The other 3 mechanics are so plainly fundamental to the nature of gravity flipping, but Space Station 2's conveyor belts are a commonly seen secondary mechanic in other platformers. These conveyor belts don't make a lot of sense in a game about flipping gravity, but in a game about not jumping, they fit perfectly. Conveyor belts in other platformers are often completely trivialized by just constantly making tiny jumps, so the push of the conveyor belt doesn't affect your character. In VVV, you can't jump. Space Station 2 almost always places the conveyor belts directly across from spikes, meaning players cannot simply flip their way past the challenges. A challenge like this, that requires the player to slowly walk against the belt while dodging hazards, would be completely trivialized by jumping. In many ways, Space Station 2 is the opposite of the game's overworld. The overworld instills in the player a sense of freedom. Flying effortlessly screen after screen, Captain Viridian controls like a superhero. Space Station 2 takes this freedom away, and instead shows us just how constraining Viridian's abilities are. Space Station 2 takes this concept to its logical conclusion in easily my favorite challenge in VVV, the infamous Veni Vidi Vici. After falling down several screens, the player comes across a shiny trinket. It is in plain sight, but between Viridian and the trinket lay a single block. Since Viridian cannot jump, this tiny pebble amounts to an impenetrable boulder. Getting over the block requires flipping, which sends Viridian plummeting through a maze of spikes towards the only available platform 6 screens above. Veni Vidi Vici is easily the most talked about aspect of VVV, and for good reason. Veni Vidi Vici did something for me no other precision platformer has. Some platformer stages have left me elated, others have left me feeling crushed and defeated. Veni Vidi Vici made me laugh. Veni Vidi Vici is so completely absurd, it's downright hilarious. Everything about it reads like a joke. It is brilliant that the player enters from the top and must first fall down past the entire challenge, seeing the absurd difficulty of it. The whole thing reads like a setup. When Viridian lands at the bottom and you see the one tile that separates you and the trinket, you're hit with the punchline. I have played a lot of very difficult platformers. I have 100%ed Celeste. Veni Vidi Vici is not nearly as hard as getting the Moonberry in Celeste was, but the sense of satisfaction for beating Veni Vidi Vici is unparalleled. I've never seen a game goad the players the way Veni Vidi Vici does. VVV is otherwise quite a friendly game, but not here. Here, VVV taunts its players. You know Kavanaugh doesn't think you can do it. The level design screams this. Not to mention, the terminal before the challenge literally says as such. And so, when you ultimately overcome it, it's all the more satisfying. It's no stretch to interpret Veni Vidi Vici as an incredibly significant element of the game. At the very beginning of this review, I likened the multifaceted checkpoint to a Swiss Army knife. Checkpoints have many uses, but Veni Vidi Vici features easily my favorite one. The screen before VVVVV is bluntly titled, The Warning. It features a narrow tunnel of conveyor belts with no hazards and 11 consecutive checkpoints. Checkpoints are already Swiss Army knives, but here they ascend past their mechanical functions. This room is downright cinematic. Nothing could foreshadow the challenge of VVVVV better than The Warning. There is no danger in this room, and yet the tension is so thick you could cut it with a checkpoint. Kavanaugh, in a Reddit post on September 9th, 2012, actually commented on this part of the game. He says, VVVVV had to exist, basically. I didn't make it because I thought it would be fun, or because I thought anyone would honestly want to do it. I made it because the world demanded it, because it was a logical place for the design to extend. It's funny, I kind of thought of it as the worst part of the game when I released VVV. Now, I think it's probably the best. I am not surprised to hear Kavanaugh doubted VVVVV's inclusion. Because of the nature of it, it is frustrating in a way nothing else in VVV is. But Kavanaugh is absolutely right. Like the other aspects we've considered so far, VVVVV initially seems to go against the ideals of a precision platformer. Precision platformers, since Jumper in 2004, pride themselves on a feeling of fairness. VVVVV is an absurd difficulty spike. The sharp, instantaneous screen transitions make it almost dizzying. The way the level design taunts the player only deepens the frustration. In any other platformer, VVVVV would have been the worst part of the game. But in VVV, it's the complete opposite. This moment is where VVV ascends into a work of sheer greatness. This is the moment where the pieces connect. In this moment, facing a trivial challenge made to be insurmountable, we are forced to reckon with VVV's true nature. We at once finally see gravity flipping for all it is. Staring at that trinket, we see the entire game from a bird's eye view. It calls back to us the thrill of soaring through space, the frustrations of the steps Viridian has gotten stuck on before, the times we wished we could jump, the times we were glad we didn't have to, the triumphs, the defeats, all merging together into this single moment. VVVVV tells us that with every strength there is always a weakness, and in this moment, we face ours. Throughout this review, I've made a handful of passes at VVV's enigmatic title. On a surface level, VVV's title represents the first initials of the 6 crew members depicted in the game. Digging a bit deeper, it might represent a sine wave as a nod to its surprising origins. But there is one interpretation I haven't fully addressed, and it is the most obvious. As I alluded to at the start, VVV's title reflects the thousands of spikes that litter the game's ceiling and floors. If VVV's title depicts spikes, then which way are the spikes facing? VVV's title might look like 6 spikes facing downward, but staring instead into the negative space, we can see 5 spikes pointing up. This, to me, is the true nature of VVV. We've reviewed VVV twice now, once focusing on what the game is, and once focusing on what the game isn't. But really, these concepts are not separate. The stages in VVV exist in the context of its overworld. What Viridian can do exists in the context of what Viridian cannot do. For every cliff, there is a pit. For every gravitron, there is a VVVVV. All of this comes together to paint a truly complete picture of the singular mechanic VVV explores. This is the paradox at the core of VVV. It is a game simple enough that you probably understood it immediately. It's focused only on one mechanic and spends its short duration pushing that mechanic to its logical extreme. And yet, the craft and care VVV takes in this pursuit are so deep, so varied, and so intricate that it has taken the better part of an hour for us to understand them. Much like the mechanic that defines it, VVV is bifurcated by its design. It is sometimes difficult, but also sometimes easy. It is in some ways a platformer, yet in others something else entirely. It is simple, but at the same time, complex. The spikes in VVV's title exemplify this perfectly. The spikes are definitely facing downwards, and yet, equally, they also face up, each the reflection of the other. each the other's perfect opposite, each in a superposition of up and down, of positive and of negative. And yet, somehow, these two opposites combine to sketch the outline of something pure, beautiful, complete. Somehow together, they form something whole.